Can two countries make peace without trust? That's the question sitting in front of us right now. And it sounds philosophical until you realize it's also completely literal. We have a memorandum signed at Versailles. We have a 60-day clock running. We have a vice president flying back and forth to a lakeside hotel in Switzerland. We have oil tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz one day and Iran declaring the strait closed the next. And underneath all of it, we have one fact that nobody on either side is bothering to deny. Neither party believes a word the other one says. So let's think this through the way you'd actually have to if you were sitting in Tehran or Washington and had to make a decision your country would have to live with. Here's where things actually stand. Back in February, the United States and Israel launched a military campaign aimed at regime change in Iran. It lasted, by most honest counts, about 5 weeks of actual fighting before Washington started looking for an exit. Iran's nuclear sites took damage. The program wasn't eliminated. Iran's missile network and regional proxy structure were bruised but not broken, and Iran responded by squeezing the one lever that actually moves global markets, the Strait of Hormuz, the channel through which roughly a fifth of the planet's oil has historically passed. That single move did more to bring the White House to the negotiating table than 3 decades of speeches about regime change ever could. By the end of June, both governments had signed a memorandum of understanding, not in Geneva, not in Doha, at the Palace of Versailles, with French and other G7 leaders standing nearby, applauding a peace they had no part in negotiating. 14 points. The headline items: Washington lifts sanctions, unfreezes Iranian assets, ends its naval blockade, stops the bombing. Tehran reopens Hormuz to commercial traffic, toll-free for 60 days, and reaffirms on paper that it will not build a nuclear weapon. The actual hard questions: the enriched uranium stockpile, the missile program, Iran's regional network of allied groups, all got kicked into a 60-day negotiating window that is, as of this week, still running in Switzerland. And here is where theory runs straight into the friction of reality, which is exactly where theory is supposed to be tested. Within 48 hours of the signing, Iran announced it was closing Hormuz again, not because of anything America did directly, but because Israel kept striking targets in southern Lebanon, in violation of what Tehran considered baked into the same deal. Washington said the strait was never actually closed, that traffic kept moving, that this was Iranian theater. Both of those things were, in their own way, true. The main central shipping lane still has roughly 80 mines in it that need clearing. Smaller routes through Omani and Iranian waters stayed open the whole time. So you had the strange spectacle of Iran issuing a closure announcement and CENTCOM publishing photos of tankers moving calmly through the same waterway on the same day. That's not a contradiction. That's two governments performing for two different audiences, while the actual oil keeps flowing regardless. Then came the toll question, which on the surface looks technical, and underneath is the entire relationship in miniature. The memorandum guarantees toll-free passage for 60 days. Iran has so far made no move to charge anything, but the American president said publicly that if a final deal isn't reached when those 60 days expire, the United States itself will impose tolls on the strait, and that the revenue belongs to America, not Iran, as payment, in his words, for services rendered, as what he called the guardian angel of the region. Think about what that sentence is actually claiming. It's not a negotiating position about freedom of navigation. It's an assertion that the United States, a country 8,000 miles away, has a superior claim to revenue generated by a waterway running through Iranian and Omani territorial seas, on the basis of having recently bombed the country on the other side of it. And the fact that this can be said out loud without anyone in Washington blinking tells you something important. The assumption that American military primacy in the Gulf is simply natural, simply background, not something requiring justification, has been so completely absorbed into the political bloodstream there that it no longer registers as a claim at all. It registers as weather. Now let's go to Lebanon, because Lebanon is currently the actual fuse, more than the strait, more than the uranium stockpile. The memorandum called for an immediate end to military operations on every front, Lebanon included. A ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah was announced. Within 48 hours, 4 Israeli soldiers were killed in the south, and then dozens of Lebanese civilians and fighters were killed in the strikes that followed, even after the so-called ceasefire took effect. Lebanese health authorities are putting the death toll since March above 4,000. The Israeli national security minister went on television and said all of Lebanon should become Israel's playground, that Lebanon shouldn't be separated from Hezbollah at all, that even 1,000 grieving Lebanese mothers is an acceptable price, as long as not one more Israeli mother grieves. The finance minister used almost identical language about opening the gates of hell. The prime minister said nothing in response. The foreign minister said nothing. It took a former prime minister, now a political rival positioning for October elections, to even publicly call this an embarrassment. And even then, the criticism was that the minister was a clown who doesn't represent Israeli values. Not that the policy of continued strikes inside another sovereign country is the actual problem. This is where the standard framing of this conflict runs into serious trouble. Most coverage treats this as two roughly symmetrical state actors, Israel and Iran, with competing security interests, and Washington as a referee trying to manage both. That framing doesn't survive contact with what we're actually watching. What we're watching is a structural arrangement in which a smaller regional party has, for 3 decades, set the boundaries of the larger global powers policy, not the other way around. Whether you call it lobbying, ideological capture, financial pressure, or simply a sustained campaign to make any deviation politically costly for any American politician, the mechanism matters less than the outcome, which is observable and consistent. Washington's stated position on a two-state solution hasn't changed in decades, but its actual conduct, including a unilateral veto on Palestinian UN membership in 2024 against every other Security Council vote, but 2 abstentions, has tracked the preferences of one regional government almost without exception. Why does this matter for whether Iran can trust the current deal? Because it tells you whose internal politics actually determine whether the 60-day window survives. This isn't really a US-Iran negotiation with Israel as a bystander. Israel's domestic coalition, a coalition that currently includes ministers under international arrest warrants for war crimes, ministers who say openly that ceasefires are weakness, ministers who are actively undermining the diplomatic position of their own government's stated ally, has both the incentive and apparently the latitude to keep this conflict running, regardless of what Washington and Tehran agree to on paper. If you're sitting in Tehran trying to calculate the actual probability that this deal survives 60 days, you can't just model Washington's intentions. You have to model a second government's domestic coalition politics. One you have no leverage over, one you have limited visibility into, and ask whether they will let the larger deal hold or whether they will blow it up to protect their own political position. That's not a trust problem in the conventional sense. Trust implies you're evaluating whether a counterparty will keep its word. What Iran actually faces is a coordination problem nested inside an agency problem. Even if the American president wants this deal to hold, and there's reasonable evidence he does, since a global oil shock is the single fastest way to destroy his own approval ratings, he does not fully control the actor most likely to blow it up. That is structurally a much harder problem to solve through diplomacy, because you can sign documents with people who want a deal. You cannot sign a binding document with a domestic political faction in someone else's country that has decided sabotage serves its own survival. But set that aside for a moment and ask the other question: does Iran even need to trust Washington to benefit from this arrangement? Here's where the more interesting answer emerges, because it isn't really about trust at all, it's about deterrence economics. Consider what Iran has actually gained, independent of whether this deal collapses on day 45 or day 59. Sanctions relief and asset unfreezing, even partial and temporary, restores liquidity that compounds. Oil sales resuming at anything close to full volume and CENTCOM itself has been citing record daily barrel counts moving through the strait during the ceasefire window, generates revenue Iran did not have access to in March. The naval blockade lifting restores normal trade flows. None of that requires trusting Trump's character. It requires only that the deal hold long enough for money to move, and money that has already moved is much harder to claw back than a promise is to break. There's a second asymmetry worth naming plainly. The war's stated objective, regime change, unconditional disarmament, the dismantling of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, was not achieved. Iran is, by any honest accounting, in a stronger negotiating position now than before the war started, because it demonstrated that closing or threatening to close Hormuz imposes costs on the global economy that no amount of military pressure on Iranian soil can offset. That is the actual lesson of the last 4 months, and it's a lesson every other mid-sized power with access to a choke point, a strait, a canal, a pipeline route is absorbing in real time. You don't need to defeat the stronger party militarily. You need to demonstrate that the stronger party's own economy is more fragile than yours is durable. This also explains something that otherwise looks strange: Iran's response to the American president's rhetoric. He has on multiple occasions threatened, in extremely graphic terms, to erase Iran as a civilization, to ensure negotiators don't make it home. Language that under any normal diplomatic framework would itself be considered an act of aggression. And Iran's actual response has been closer to a shrug than outrage. Not because the words don't matter morally, they do. And there is a real cost to normalizing that kind of language from any head of state, because it erodes whatever thin restraint still exists across the wider region. But because Iran's negotiators have apparently concluded that the rhetoric and the actual policy aren't perfectly correlated, the words are partly for a domestic American audience. The policy that matters is being negotiated in a hotel by a lake in Switzerland, where the actual incentives, record oil flow, an American economy that cannot absorb $5 gasoline indefinitely, a political base that has made clear it wants no more Middle East wars, point toward the deal holding rather than collapsing. That last point deserves its own moment, because there's a real divergence right now between elite consensus and public opinion in the United States that's much sharper than most coverage acknowledges. A political and media class that has been reflexively supportive of military action against Iran for years, sitting on top of a public that polling consistently shows wants out of these conflicts, that blames the broader regional war machine for the cost of living, and that does not distinguish much between which party is in office when it comes to who gets blamed for gas prices and frozen grocery bills. If the current administration closes this deal and makes it durable past the 60-day mark, it will be doing something genuinely unusual, aligning with its own public against a permanent bipartisan, well-funded policy establishment that has had the opposite preference for 30 years. So where does that leave the actual question? Can Iran trust Trump? I'd reframe it the way the more careful Iranian negotiators are already reframing it internally. The right question isn't trust. It's whether Iran retains a credible, demonstrated capacity to retaliate and impose costs if this deal is violated again, the way it has twice already in the last year, when negotiations were used as cover for renewed strikes. On that question, the answer right now appears to be yes. Iran has shown repeatedly across this entire war that it has both the will and the capability to close or threaten the one choke point the rest of the world cannot ignore. That capability is the actual security guarantee here, not a signature on a memorandum. Peace in this case isn't being built on trust. It's being built on each side's updated assessment of what the other side is capable of doing if trust is broken again, which is in fact a far more durable foundation than it sounds. Because unlike promises, demonstrated capability doesn't need to be believed. It only needs to be remembered. Where this goes from here depends on three variables I'd watch over the next several weeks, not the next several days. First, whether the technical talks in Switzerland produce an actual mechanism for Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. That's the one issue both sides have so far successfully avoided deciding, which means it's the one most likely to blow up the entire framework once they're finally forced to. Second, whether the Lebanon track holds independent of Israel's domestic coalition incentives. Given the public statements coming out of that cabinet this week, that is a genuinely open question. Third, whether record Hormuz traffic translates into enough real economic relief on the Iranian side fast enough that the deal becomes self-reinforcing, rather than something that can be casually abandoned the moment it becomes politically convenient for someone to abandon it. None of those variables are about whether anyone trusts anyone. They're about whether enough material interest has accumulated on enough sides that breaking the arrangement becomes more expensive than keeping it. That's a colder way to think about peace than the language of trust and goodwill you hear at press conferences. But it also happens to be the only kind of peace that has ever actually lasted in a region where promises have a documented habit of expiring the moment the cameras move on. Every war eventually produces a moment where the exhausted parties decide that ending it serves them better than continuing it. We may be at that moment now, or we may be 6 weeks from watching it collapse the same way 2 earlier ceasefire windows collapsed into renewed bombing. The variable that will actually decide which of those futures we get isn't sitting in Washington. It isn't sitting in Tehran. It's sitting in Jerusalem, inside a coalition that currently has more incentive to keep this war alive than either of the two countries that actually signed the deal. Watch that coalition, not the signatures.